This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is what happens when a system quietly rehearses life without breaks, when the language of force becomes casual, when emergency stops meaning rare, when oversight turns into a calendar, not a check. You are supposed to believe the guardrails are automatic. That law is a reflex, that institutions correct course on their own. But what if the correction mechanism is the first thing being worn down slowly, legally, and in plain sight? Because once power learns it can move without permission, it doesn't need to declare itself. It just proceeds. If you want to understand what's actually moving underneath the noise, stay with me, subscribe if you haven't. Now, let me show you what's really in control here. You think the system is controlled by elections, by speeches, by public fights? But that's not what steers it now. What controls it is momentum, the invisible machinery that starts turning the moment a president hints, even casually. That force is on the table. The legal levers that activate the moment an emergency is declared. The procedural fog that rolls in when oversight gets delayed, deferred, under review, until accountability becomes a rumor. And here's the part that should unsettle you. None of this requires a coup in the street. It can happen with paperwork, with votes taken at the right moment, with silence in the right committees. So when members of the president's own party draw a line when they move to limit unilateral war-making power, that's not drama. That is an alarm from inside the building. And once that alarm sounds, the question isn't who's right, it's what else has already started moving. You think big shifts announce themselves. They don't. They arrive as temporary, as just this once, as an exception that gets reused until it stops feeling like an exception at all. Before, presidential power had friction, a pause, a negotiation with Congress, a need to explain. Now, the new normal is speed. Threat first, justification later. Emergency now, debate never. Oversight as a promise that keeps slipping into the future. And the most dangerous part is that it feels efficient. It feels decisive. It feels like finally someone is doing something. But efficiency in government is not automatically virtue. Sometimes it's the sound of consent being bypassed. This is the silent shift. Power no longer has to persuade. It only has to proceed while everyone else argues about tone, personality, optics. So when you hear lawmakers suddenly reaching for old constitutional tools, it's not nostalgia. It's muscle memory. It's the body remembering pain. And the next symptom is where this stops being theoretical. Last week, the line moved in public, not in a press conference, not in a rumor, in a vote. Republican senators joined Democrats to advance a war powers resolution, an instrument designed for one purpose: to stop a president from dragging the country toward military action without Congress. That is not an insult. It is not partisan theater. It is a constitutional brake pulled hard enough to make noise. And why now? Because the president has been openly floating military action against a territory that belongs to an ally, not an abstract somewhere, not a faceless adversary, allied soil. Do you understand what that does to the architecture holding American power together? It turns treaties into suggestions. It turns deterrence into confusion. It forces allies to plan for the unthinkable. If you want the rest of this mapped clearly, what this vote signals, what it can't stop, and what's already in motion, stay with me. Because the cliff is not the vote. The cliff is what the vote is trying to prevent. What you're watching is not chaos. It's a transfer. Here's the hidden mechanism. The system has a way of moving power uphill toward the presidency, especially when three conditions appear at the same time: a military option being floated, an emergency being declared, and oversight being delayed just long enough for the moment to pass. Step one, the suggestion of force. It doesn't matter if it's framed as leverage. The moment it's said out loud, the apparatus treats it as real. Planning begins. Contingencies are drafted. Allies start hedging. Markets start pricing uncertainty. Step two, the emergency. A legal word that sounds like protection, but functions like acceleration. Emergency powers centralize decisions, bypass debate, and collapse timelines. Authority consolidates quietly behind closed doors. Step 3, the fog, the promised disclosures, the Inspector General reviews, the deadlines that slip, not because no one cares, but because delay is a form of control. It starves oversight without having to defeat it. Who benefits? The executive, the actors positioned closest to unilateral decisions, and whoever profits when public attention gets flooded. Who absorbs the damage? Congress, allies, and ultimately you, because you live downstream of every precedent. And now you're about to see the second shock. Shorter, faster, less forgiving. It doesn't happen all at once. It stacks. While Congress is trying to pull a war break, the president declares a national emergency over Venezuelan oil assets. Different subject, different headline, same effect. Power moves inward. Read that again. A national emergency, not during an immediate catastrophe, not in response to something suddenly new in the public record here, declared in the middle of a political firestorm, when attention is already split. And emergencies do something almost magical in Washington. They make debate feel optional. They make delay feel dangerous. They make unilateral action feel like responsibility. So now you have two tracks running at once. War powers on one side, emergency authority on the other, Congress trying to reassert itself in one lane while the executive expands in the next. And then comes the third pressure point. Lawmakers publicly asking why promised document disclosures haven't appeared, why Inspector General reviews have stalled, why timelines keep slipping. That's not a separate story. That's the pressure gauge. Because when oversight tightens, the noise gets louder. And when the noise gets loud enough, people stop hearing the alarm. Here's the cliff. You can't undo a precedent after it's been used. This is the part where you're supposed to stay abstract. Constitutional theory, process, procedure, the kind of thing people scroll past, but you don't live in theory. You live in the consequences of a system that stops asking permission. If military threats against allied territory become casual, markets don't wait for Congress to catch up. Prices move, volatility spikes, retirement accounts wobble, businesses freeze hiring. Not because of one law, but because predictability, the thing your life quietly depends on, starts to evaporate. If emergency becomes routine, you don't get more safety. You get less voice. Decisions that shape energy, trade, and conflict get made faster than public consent can form. And once that becomes normal, it doesn't matter who sits in the Oval Office, the tool stays on the shelf, ready. And when oversight turns into endless delays, documents promised, reviews stalled, what you learn is simple. Accountability is now optional unless someone forces it to be mandatory. So yes, you can keep watching this like politics, or you can recognize it as governance being rewritten in real time. If you've made it this far, share this and subscribe, because the cost of not seeing this is always paid later. And next, we widen the frame, because this doesn't stay inside one country's walls. When an American president treats force like a bargaining chip, it doesn't stay a domestic argument. It becomes an international signal. Greenland is not just a cold place on a map. In your reference, it's tied to Denmark, a founding NATO member, and that matters because NATO is not a vibe, it's a promise. Collective defense. The idea that an attack on one is treated as an attack on all. And here's the destabilizing truth. Alliance credibility is not destroyed by invasion. It's destroyed earlier by uncertainty. By allies quietly asking, do we still know what the United States means? If the United States is perceived as threatening allied territory, the architecture changes. European cooperation starts to fray. Intelligence sharing becomes cautious. Contingency planning replaces trust. And adversaries don't have to win a war to benefit. They only have to watch the alliance wobble. Russia, China, Iran, your reference, names them for a reason. Because the propaganda victory would arrive before any policy paper gets printed. So now the danger is no longer what happens next week. It's what happens when allies begin acting as if the guarantee has expired. And that pushes us into the future where there are only a few ways this can go. From here, there are three paths. None of them are comfortable. And the system will drift into one of them, whether anyone chooses it or not. One path is adjustment. Congress treats this moment like a real stress test. War powers get enforced. Emergency declarations get scrutinized. Oversight timelines stop slipping. The brake works not perfectly, but enough to restore friction. The presidency remains powerful, but not unchecked. The precedent becomes limits exist and they get used. The second path is erosion. The votes happen, the statements get made, and then the next crisis arrives, attention fractures, the emergency becomes normal, oversight stays delayed. The executive learns it can outlast resistance by outpacing it. Nothing breaks dramatically. It just thins. Year by year, the guardrails become decorative. The third path is rupture. A threat becomes an action. An emergency becomes a template. Oversight collapses into performative hearings. Allies hedge openly. Markets price in governance risk as a permanent condition. And once that happens, you don't return to the old system. You inherit a new one. I'm not telling you which path we're on. I'm telling you the forces pushing us are already active. And the ending depends on whether the next step is restraint or acceleration. So here's what I can't give you: comfort, closure, a clean ending where the system corrects itself because it's supposed to. What you have right now is a presidency testing how far it can move without Congress, and a Congress, including members of the president's own party, testing whether it still remembers how to stop it. War powers, emergency powers, oversight delayed into fog. 3 fronts, 1 pattern. And the central danger is not this week's headline, it's the precedent. Because once threaten first, justify later becomes routine, once emergency becomes a standing setting, once accountability can be postponed indefinitely, then the system doesn't need a dramatic overthrow. It simply stops answering to limits. If you want to keep tracking where this goes, who holds, who folds, and what the next escalation looks like, subscribe and turn on notifications. And follow the thread into the next video, because this story only gets clearer the further it advances. Don't look for the moment it breaks. Look for the moment you stop expecting it to hold.